Thank you, Clay. This morning we're continuing a series that we started last week, and I know it's a bad time to start a series right before you leave for about 2 to 3 weeks. We'll pick this up when I get back, but I'd like us to go through Philippians. And so we're picked up really in verse 18 through verse 30. And now we're going to be looking at another aspect of joy. That's really the point of this series, is to cultivate joy. How do we cultivate joy as Christians? What does it mean? And what do we look at? And so last week we looked at a couple of things we saw about joy. We saw that joy is not limited to an emotional response. It's not just something I have as a response. A joy is in many ways something I participate in. And so we saw it similar to, in many ways, like romantic love. Romantic love is it's infatuating. It's a novelty when you first experience it, and you're excited about it, and you have energy about it, you're passionate about it. But over time, it cultivates into something much deeper. And I think Christian joy is very similar. That when we first experience becoming a Christian, we have this emotional response. Things are new, things are exciting. But over time, we are meant to cultivate a much deeper sense of joy and understanding what joy is. And joy comes from God. It is a part of the fruit of the Spirit. So in cultivating joy, then, we have to know where to begin and what to do. And this morning, we are going to look at what Paul says here, because Paul, his section here is in many ways defined and beginned in verse 20, where he says, "It is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death." And I want us to see this morning that courage is a necessary part of joy. That in fact, I'm not sure we can have joy without courage. And that courage is something as Christians we are supposed to have. It's something that's expected of us. It's something that God has expected of his children since the Old Testament. There's so many Old Testament stories looking at even Moses and Joshua where they encourage the Israelites to have courage, to take courage, to believe in God, to trust God. You see the women, the midwives, they had courage and they hid Moses. You see the story of Esther. Esther is a story of this woman with incredible courage. I mean, that really is the story of Esther, is this woman with an amazing amount of courage, who went before the king even when she wasn't called, which meant she should have been put to death if the king didn't put his scepter out, and she risked her life. She had courage for the sake of her people. And cowardice is something that is reprimanded by God. It is something God does not want of his children. In fact, you read of all these people who are thrown into the lake of fire and the second death in Revelation 21, and one of the characteristics is cowardice. The cowardly will not enter into the kingdom of God. And so I want us now to be looking at courage, because courage is a necessary part of joy. And even just thinking about this, it makes sense that if joy is something we participate in with God, but if the things of God are regularly opposed, then it makes sense that courage is necessary for having joy. You must have courage in order to participate in the things of God when God is regularly opposed in this world. So in order to have joy, we actually must have courage, and we must cultivate courage. And there are a few ways I want us to look at how Paul has courage and what we can exemplify in our own lives. The first is that Paul has the courage to die for Christ. So in verse 19, really the end of verse 18, Paul says, "Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." For Paul, death was a necessary part of his life. To give up his life for Christ is something that was expected of him. In many ways, it was something he owed Christ. And as Christians, I think we need to look at this in the same way. We need to understand that if we are Christians, we have a heritage, which means we are to be put to death should it be called for. Should it be called for, should tanks start rolling through the streets, should something happen in which the civility of our lives and the comfort we have is disrupted, we are called to sacrifice ourselves. Our heritage of who we are today doesn't come from Alexander Campbell. It doesn't come from Foy Wallace. It doesn't come from these guys. They were men who had good writings and good ideas, but our heritage as Christians is that Christians were put to death for believing in Christ. And we are expected to do the same thing. I don't know if you're familiar with the word martyr. But the martyr, the Greek, it's actually a Greek word that we've just taken into the English. The word martyr is actually a legal term, and it just meant like a witness. And it was either to witness against something or for something. In fact, someone could be a martyr and not be attacked. Someone actually could be a martyr and attacking someone else because you're witnessing something. But in Christianity, the word martyr, to witness, came to mean to be put to death because so many witnesses were put to death for Christ. I mean, that's our heritage. That's what we have signed up for. It wasn't in the fine print. It's not something we come to learn later. It's right in the scriptures. Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. It means come put yourself to death. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, it's translated into the English, but he once wrote that when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. That's what's expected of us. To have the courage to be someone who can go to our deaths without renouncing Jesus. And it does take courage. In fact, if we're unwilling to do that, I'm not sure we can have Christian joy in the first place. I think Christian joy comes from a place of being able to go to my death for Christ. To be happy to do so, to be willing to do so. So Paul has the courage to die for Christ. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think we have to wait until things get bad in order to know if we'd be willing to do that. I think we can actually know right now, do I give up my life for Christ right now? Do I give up the little things for Christ right now? And that's actually a very biblical concept, and it's one I adopted as a manager for when I used to oversee a crew of people, is that if people demonstrated themselves as faithful in little things, then I could trust them to be faithful in big things. And many people were very confused about why they did not get promotions, but it's because they didn't demonstrate themselves to be faithful in little things, so I'm not going to give them more work. And if we don't demonstrate ourselves to be willing to give up our lives for Christ when things are easy, I don't know that we would give them up for Christ when things get bad. That's expected of us, to be people who give up our lives for Christ. To have the courage to go to our deaths without renouncing Christ is a Christian expectation, and I think is a necessary part of Christian joy. Now there's something that may actually take even more courage, which is the courage to live for Christ. To die for Christ means that you sprint to the finish line, that you have one last wall to climb over and it's done. But to live for Christ is an endurance race. You don't know when it's going to end. And I think that takes a lot of courage, and may in some ways even take more courage. I don't know. I think it takes a lot of courage to live the rest of my life for God right now. Now, Paul, in verse 22, says, if I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard-pressed between the two. I think we understand that Paul is willing to die, but Paul says he can't choose between life and death. actually living, even though he knows it's going to be hard, and his living is going to be beneficial to other Christians, not necessarily to him. He's just going to endure more persecution and more imprisonment. He was hard-pressed to live, not just to die. It does take courage to keep living, especially when you know what God asks of you. Because God asks of us different things. And I think it takes courage for us to accept what God has asked for of us. To accept what God grants us. As he says in verse 29, Paul says, "For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engage in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have." This doesn't sound like something we'd want to be granted, does it? It's been granted to them. Paul says it's been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe, but suffer as Paul suffered in the past and now is suffering still. It had been granted to them that they would be imprisoned, that they may even be put to death. That's the thing about Philippians is Paul, he says he's confident he's going to keep living because that's necessary for the Christians, but he still isn't totally convinced. He does not know if he's going to live or die. And so I think as Christians, we need to have the courage to take what God has granted to us. Whatever that may be. What God grants to us, we don't always know when it's good. You know, sometimes God grants us things that immediately seem like bad things. Being imprisoned, being persecuted. This doesn't seem like something we'd want to be granted by God. The word grant makes it sound like it's a gift. And yet, in many ways, I think it actually was. And I think that's what Michael was trying to get across earlier in his announcement. Sometimes these difficult things are gifts in disguises. And we need to have the courage to take what God has granted to us. Not to complain, not to grumble. Right? Because if we're grumbling, we may be no different than the Israelites in the wilderness. You think about what they were granted by God. The Israelites in the wilderness were granted to have this one-on-one time with God in the wilderness. To see miracles. They saw miracles out there. They were granted by God to hear God speaking. You know, you have Moses and Aaron and the elders going up on the mountain and having a meal with God. And yet they grumbled and they complained. We would look at that and we would say, why are you complaining? And yet, many of us grumble and complain. You know, we eat a meal with God. That's what the Lord's Supper is. We worship God in the presence of God. The Israelites didn't even get that. They had to go through priests. And yet we are sometimes found grumbling and complaining about what has been granted to us. It takes courage to live out what has been granted to us in our lives. And if we're unprepared for that, if we're not ready for that, I don't know that we can have Christian joy. To accept what God has put me in, the position I'm in, without grumbling or complaining, and to go forward as hard as I can for God. The courage we need is not just to die for Christ, it's to live for Christ. It's to live for Christ, meaning that we need to view life as it's meant to be viewed. What I mean is we need to understand how God views the world. What does God think about the flesh? Have you ever wondered that? What does God think about flesh? Because I think Paul had God's view of flesh. In verse 22 and 23, Paul says, if I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I'm hard pressed between the two. He understood that living in the flesh was actually a good thing. It was good to be alive. Now, it wasn't good because he was going to go to his favorite rock concert, or he was going to go see the new movie out this weekend. It was good for him to live in the flesh because that meant fruitful labor for him. That's why it was good to be alive. And I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage to accept that as true. to say it's good for me to be alive because while I'm alive, I can work for God. I can give up the things of this world. I think that takes courage. And I think that kind of courage cultivates joy that we cannot have otherwise. We have to have the kind of courage to view life as it's meant to be viewed. If I look at my flesh and just say this is terrible, I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm probably just going to wait to die. I think this view that Paul has is actually much more courageous, to say the flesh is good when it is used in fruitful labor for God. I think that takes a tremendous amount of courage to actually accept that as true and to live it out. It takes courage to view life as it's meant to be viewed, which means viewing our flesh as God views it. It means a number of things, but there are just a couple examples I want to list. The first is that it takes courage to view our flesh as it's meant to be viewed, as God does. And the second is that it takes courage, I think, to have joy in this world. I don't know about you, but I often feel like I have to apologize to people for being joyful today, for walking down the street with a smile on my face. You look at the world around you, and people who don't accept God or don't believe in God, to them, the world is crumbling. Wherever you stand on the political scale, your party is probably failing. The world around you, you have this climate change. You have all these storms happening. You just have disaster around every corner of the earth. Why would you be happy? Why would you be joyful? And I often feel like I have to just stifle my joy. Because to me, to have joy in a world such as ours is almost like just laughing at a funeral. The world is dying and crumbling around us, and yet we're expected to have joy. And I think it takes courage to have joy today. Because things appear to be going so bad, and yet I know so clearly that God is in total control, and there's nothing that is outside of his control. I have nothing to worry about. Last night, I was sitting there, and I heard these fireworks going off outside. I know it's a holiday weekend, but I cannot understand why on the East Coast you guys are still doing fireworks in September. Makes no sense to me, and my dog hates it. So I'm sitting there, and my dog comes up. She's obviously terrified of these fireworks, and I'm listening to him, and I know that nothing is going to happen. These are just sounds and noises. And so I take her and I sit her next to me, and I just hold her for a moment. And I started thinking, I bet God views sin in the exact same way. That to us, we hear these things happening, and it sounds like sin is around us. It's right around the corner. The devil is going to get us. And yet to God, it's just like the sound of fireworks. You can't touch him. And if I go to God, there's nothing that can happen to me. I'm sitting here just like my dog, shaking with fear for no reason, because God is in total control. It takes joy. It takes courage to have joy in this world, to actually find comfort in God and to say things are okay. And when they're not okay, it's not because things are outside of God's control. It takes courage to live. It takes courage to live in a way that Christ is glorified. In verse 25, Paul says, "Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again." I want you to read that carefully. Paul has just told us in verse 23, "My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better." That's what he wants. He wants to die. And yet, he tells us here in verse 25 that he knows that if he remains with them, that Christ will be glorified. He says in verse 26, "So that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus." Paul not only prefers death, which is something I have a hard time with, but then he's able to give up what he prefers so that Christ is glorified. I mean, what a shallow view I have of life compared to this. Not only does Paul prefer death, but he gives up what he prefers for the glory of Christ. And I think that takes tremendous amount of courage. The courage not only to just accept death as being better than living, but the courage to be able to give up what we prefer for the glory of Christ. And I think if we're unwilling to do that, we will not understand joy and rejoicing as the Bible expects us to. Now, we are to have the courage to die for Christ. We are to have the courage to live for Christ. And lastly, I want to point out for you verse 27, which this is one of those passages that keeps me up at night. Verse 27 says, "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ." My Bible has a footnote that says, behave as citizens worthy of Christ. Worthy of the gospel of Christ. What a command. What a heavy burden this is to read this. To say, I must live in a way that is worthy of the gospel. I mean, we read this and we understand, I don't live in a way that's worthy of the gospel. There's nothing I can do to be worthy of the gospel. In fact, my unworthiness is one of the things that brought me to the gospel in the first place. That snapped me out of what I was doing so that I would remember that I'm on an earth with a God and God expects things of me. It is precisely my unworthiness that brought me to where I am, and yet I'm supposed to somehow live in a way that is worthy of the gospel of Christ, as if I'm worthy of the death of Jesus. I mean, who of us can fulfill this? And yet my unworthiness doesn't take this away. It doesn't negate it. It's still there. It still stands. That I am to live a life worthy of the gospel. A life that Jesus can look at and say, I'm glad I died for that man. I have to live like that. It takes courage to live like this. It takes a lot of courage to live like this. To be able to say that death is better than life and that I am willing to give up what is better for the glory of Christ. It takes a lot of courage to live in a way that is worthy of the gospel every single day. And yet, if we're to have joy, this is a courage we must know and be familiar with. That is how we cultivate joy, is through courage. Participating in the things of God, like I said, is God is regularly opposed. And yet we're to participate in the things of God. Therefore, we must have courage to cultivate joy in the first place. But then Paul goes on to say, he says, let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, verse 27, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you're standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. I don't think it's any coincidence that in dealing with living a life that is worthy of the gospel, he immediately goes into church unity and being united. I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. Because courage is built up in numbers in many ways. Courage is fruitful in numbers. We can take it. This is why Jesus sent people out 2 by 2, right? Because we have more courage in numbers. This is also why when you interrogate someone, you break them away from the herd, right? So they're by themselves. There's something about being in numbers that not only builds up courage, but I would argue it takes courage to be united in the first place. Because if I'm to be united with you, that means I have to be exposed before you. You have to know who I am. I have to actually lay myself out before you. That takes courage. And we can't be united in a way other than that. I have to come before you and be exposed, all my flaws as well as my strengths. It takes courage to do something like that. And yet this is a joy and a courage that comes through unity, standing in one spirit, in one mind, to live in a way that is worthy of the gospel. He goes on to say in verse 28, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. Did you notice that living a life worthy of the gospel, having this courage Paul has been talking about, and the unity of the church are signs of salvation? That's one of the reasons why we're going through 1 John in our Sunday morning class, is so that we can be assured of salvation, know how we're saved. We can know whether we're abiding in God or not. This is a sign of salvation. Being united, of one spirit, of one mind, having the courage not to be frightened by anything that our opponents may say. Now, we may not face these same kind of opponents. Paul continues after he says that, not frightened anything that your opponents, verse 29, for it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had and now hear that I still have. We don't have opponents like that right now where we are, that would put us in prison and even to death for our belief in the gospel. But this is not to say that we don't have opponents. We do. We regularly face opponents. There are very loud opponents of the gospel today. If you even go into a university campus, when the classes that I took in getting my degree, it was very obvious that it was assumed that anyone who believes in any kind of religion is ignorant or stupid. It was never explicitly said, but it was assumed. It was publicly assumed as a fact. Now, I could have been afraid of that, or I could have said, no, that's not true. You're telling me lies. We're to have the courage to stand up to opponents of the gospel. And we will face our opponents today. There are people who suggest that to die is loss. Verse 21, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Is that true? There are many people who don't explicitly state it, but they publicly suggest that to die is loss. You lose everything when you die. All that you worked for, all your finances, all your riches, all your 401ks, all your homes, all your property, it's gone. You lose everything. But that's not what the scripture says. Do I have the courage to say, no, that's not true? To die is gain. There are opponents who suggest that spirituality is true, but Christianity is wrong. Very common today. Many people want to be spiritually minded, but they don't think the Bible's true. They want to take God and they want to take Jesus and they want to extrapolate him from the Bible and say this is all wrong, but this God-Jesus stuff, there's some truth there. Those are opponents of the gospel today. Very loud, very clear opponents. And we should not be frightened in anything they say because there's not an ounce of truth to it. We have our opponents and we are to have courage to stand up to these opponents. Not to be frightened by them. When the guy with the PhD tells me that God isn't real, I'm not frightened by that. I met guys with PhD who think God is real. It doesn't mean anything. I've met guys with PhDs who are Christians. Some of the smartest men I've ever met. We are not to be frightened in anything by our opponents. We are to have courage. And we have every reason to have courage. God gives us good reasons to have courage. God comes through for us. God answers prayers. I mean, I don't know about you, but there are times in my life where God has answered very specific prayers very specifically. What do I do with that? Do I just say, well, God doesn't exist even though these have been answered? We are not to be frightened in anything because if we are frightened by our opponents, I don't think we can find joy in the gospel. This series is about cultivating joy. How do we cultivate joy? Courage is a huge part of that. We are to have the courage to live a Christian life, to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ. It takes courage, but it also brings us tremendous joy. And it is necessary for cultivating joy. And if we are cowards, if we are uncourageous, I don't think we'll have this joy that Paul is describing. I don't think we'll be able to rejoice as Paul rejoiced. A courageous life is a joyful life. You'll notice that in verse 20, for Paul, the opposite of courage is actually being ashamed. He says, "As is my eager expectation and hope, that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body." He didn't want to be ashamed. He wanted to have the courage to live for Christ, that Christ would be honored in his body. If there's anyone here this morning who would like to be baptized, if there's anyone who needs prayers, if there's anything at all that we can do for you, please make your need known while we stand and sing the invitation song.
378.